never been, oops, got that, has never been more needed. And for possibly the first time in history, the supply of emergency funding for students is actually meeting demand, thanks to the influx of billions of dollars distributed under HEERF. But as the short-term solution, it's a short-term solution, and the funds aren't going to last forever. And even with the outreach and offering of funds, it was still difficult for many schools to identify those students that were most in need. Institutions are going to need to prepare for sustainable practice, not only maximizes HEERF today, but also ensures emergency aid that can be effective and present as a retention tool and beyond. Today, our speakers are going to discuss the ways in which they identify those students most in need and how they're delivering the short-term funding they desperately need. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers. The first is Tim Lehman. He's the Vice President of Student Financial Services at Southern New Hampshire University. With over 35 years of experience in higher education financing, Tim has built a reputation as a thought leader in the area of technology and customer experience, as well as commitment to compliance to help colleges and universities achieve optimization goals. He began his career in the nonprofit sector and has worked for both for-profit and nonprofit institutions focused primarily on distance education. For the past 5 years, while at Southern New Hampshire University, Tim has helped guide the institution through significant growth and has assisted with improving the student experience by being relentlessly focused on creating and integrating the right technology to deliver a student experience that is optimized, scalable, compliant, and streamlined to achieve the university's goals. Tim has a bachelor's degree from Concordia College in Minnesota and an MBA at Capella University. He's been a presenter at numerous conferences and seminars on the topics of higher education. We also have David Helene. David is the founder and CEO of Equity, a provider of equitable and effective cash transfer administration technology for post-secondary government partners. Under his leadership, Equity has worked with over 30 innovative partners in post-secondary education to process over 100 million in emergency grants to over 100,000 students, 40% of whom have been student parents. He's helped the organization attract over 8 million in support from some of the most innovative national post-secondary funding partners in the country, including ECMC Foundation, the Crage Foundation, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the Lumina Foundation, Strata Education Network, Imaginable Futures, WG Labs, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and others. For his work in equity, David was named to 2020 Forbes 30 Under 30 in social entrepreneurship. Prior to Equity, David founded a nonprofit college access organization called Unify Scholars and spent nearly 3 years at the Clearinghouse, a financial trade association and payments company representing the interests of the nation's largest commercial banks. With that, we are very excited to present them both. I just want to let you know, if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. Depending on the question, we may interject with the presenters, or we may end up holding it until the end, but rest assured, we will try to get to everyone's question. So thank you, Tim and David, very much. And we're going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. And thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us. I'm happy to be here, excited to be presenting with a friend of mine, a gentleman that I call a friend of mine, David Helene. And we're excited to walk you through kind of what his organization does, as well as how our organization has been able to work closely with Equity to kind of assist in SNHU standing up our own emergency type of financial aid program. Let me make sure I can do the slides. So what I wanted to start out with was just kind of where we got to where we're at. At SNHU, we, as a result of the murder of George Floyd, created a $5 million fund that was to be used to assist in creating ways that we could address systemic racism, not only within our organization, but also within our ability to kind of help students. So what we received was $5 million from the Board of Trustees. And the mission was to find ways in which we could assist our students in helping them through whatever issues they were going through. And one of those projects we felt was important was the ability to provide emergency funding to students who were caught in between their ability to persist at the institution and be able to address an immediate emergency type of situation. And because what we found was that because of the fact that the Title IV regulations were not as nimble as we had hoped, we really needed to create a way that we could stand up an emergency funding type of situation or program that would allow for the scalable, immediate access to that type of funding. We at the university have emergency grant types of programs. They're scattered throughout the university. There are different application processes. There are different eligibility criteria. And what we found is that when we looked at the amount of money that was potentially able to be given out, it was very disjointed, but with all the best of intentions. And what we decided was that if we were going to do this, we wanted to do it right. And that was why we chose to partner with Equity in an effort to make sure that we were able to disperse at scale, provide a really robust and rich student experience. And I think David will share with you as well is that if you're not eligible for the funding, depending on what that criteria is, they also have the ability to put you in front of other social service types of safety net programs that we didn't have access to as a result of our national presence. Our students are all over the country, and it's very difficult for us to understand kind of where they sit and where that emergency is and try to understand how do we help them in that situation. So that was kind of where we got to. And that was the impetus behind our first attempt at creating an emergency financial aid type of process. Here's a kind of an infographic on the students that we have been able to serve. The second column over is the Equity pilot, which was the one that I'm most familiar with. And you can see the distribution of the students that we were able to assist through that $5 million investment into the university. These other projects were all part of our commitment to that diversity, equity, and inclusion program. But the one that I was most interested in and gave us the most impact, I think, was the Equity pilot. And you can see the distribution of who we were able to support in that particular model. The results of where we were or have been is that we did find that there was a significant increase in persistence as a result of providing emergency funding. We provided a $500 grant to a student who raised their hand and said they were in a situation. They were invited to then participate, and we would hand off that application to David's team, and they would take them through the application. What we then did is we, in the background, monitored were we able to see them persist from term to term. And we did it in 2 phases. You can see that we monitored them over 4 terms of enrollment and basically had the control group and the test group. And at the end of the day, the test group showed an increase of about 8% in persistence term over the control group. And which we felt was very important and was really part of the mission in terms of what we needed to do, was to try to meet the student at the point they were having this issue and be able to then see if it was actually, if we were able to solve it and continue to have them persist. looking ahead, this is where I think the meat of this discussion really comes in. We really firmly believe that there is a need to continue to create these emergency types of programs. And I'm going to turn it over to David to kind of talk about what his organization does, and then come back to kind of where we're at with, kind of where do we see the future.
Thank you so much, Tim. And really pleased to be with everyone this afternoon, and to have been able to partner with Southern New Hampshire around this really innovative and sort of ahead of its time type program. A couple of things that I want to talk about specifically to this program, particularly in the context of the broader programmatic work that we're seeing across the country. There are a few themes here that I want to point to that Southern New Hampshire has really focused on, that I think have been innovative and also emblematic of how many should be thinking about these types of programs. The first is centering students and centering equity, as we think about the desired impact of emergency aid as a programmatic tool. That was core to the work from the get-go, right? Is how do we narrow equity gaps as we think about persistence? That was a really critical piece of the Social Justice Fund, and also informed a lot of the work as we've thought about HEERF collectively. The second is, how do we think about infrastructure, right? I think, emergency aid has sort of been thought of across the country as perhaps a year-over-year thing, but often a reactive tool, one that is not thought about holistically and through a long-term policy lens. Now, for context, I know all of you on this call have been dealing with the impact of the higher education emergency relief funds, not just CARES, but also the subsequent two tranches that have been provided through the various stimulus bills. There may be an attitude that this money has come and gone, right? And we're sort of back to a world without emergency aid. But the reality is, we now have an opportunity to continue to advocate for recurring investments into these programs, because to Tim's point, they do move the needle around persistence and around student outcomes. For context, just last month, actually, I'm sorry, I should say 3 weeks ago, there was a reintroduction of what's called the Emergency Aid for College Students Act, which was a bill that was originally proposed to Congress in 2019. So this would provide a federal steady state program related to emergency aid. And given that we've seen iterations of this type of program, in the Build Back Better bill, there was, of course, the College Completion Fund, which would have allowed for an allocation around emergency aid. We should expect to see recurring investments at the state and federal level into emergency aid in the future, right? So thinking about emergency aid not as a one-off, but as infrastructure. How do we build the right infrastructure for students, not just this year, but in future years, particularly as we see the Great Resignation impact our financial aid and student affairs colleagues who are often at the helm of making these programs work. There is a strong case for technological infrastructure to make sure that these programs can perform. And the last piece of this is how do we think about a decision-making framework that's apples to apples and also is speaking to the acute needs of students, right? So I'm sure all of you have been tasked with quote unquote prioritizing need, as is the requirement in the federal guidance. But how do you do that, right? What is the methodology that speaks to acute basic needs conditions, that thinks about the conditions that are disproportionately experienced by the most underinvested students, including Black students, Latinx students, and Indigenous students in particular? And how do you make sure that you're also able to turn these funds around quickly, particularly in an environment where eviction moratoria have expired, the cost of rent has gone up by 20% in the last 12 months. We're seeing inflation up to 7.5%, right, which is a disproportionate tax on our lowest income Americans. So the need is going to be as acute as it ever has. And how do we prioritize speed in that process? So by way of background on the organization, Edquity is here to help institutions deliver emergency aid fast, equitably, and effectively at scale, right? And I want to really push on the at scale piece, because it is possible to do really high impact emergency aid in a case management framework, right? That is in fact a best practice if you can do it. If you have social workers on staff, you're able to really focus on meeting students where they are time and time again, that is a best practice. But when you're serving 5,000 students, 10,000 students, 90,000 students, 120,000 students, as many institutions now are, it is almost impossible to do an equity-centered approach to emergency aid at scale. So, what we have done is we have built an application that is based on the research of Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Rab. So for those of you who are not familiar with Sarah, Sarah is the founding director for the Hope Center for College Community and Justice. And we've taken the body of research that the Hope Center has produced to make sure that our decision-making framework is screening for conditions like food insecurity, housing insecurity, childcare issues, transportation issues, and then making a determination not just on these issues, but also the ability of the grant to move the needle around a persistence outcome to the extent that resources are scarce. We've actually removed some of those conditions in the HEERF environment because resources have been less scarce, which has been good from a student outcome standpoint. But as you think about a steady state of the world where you're having to make decisions around a finite resource set, particularly the social justice fund, $5 million, I know that sounds like a lot of money to many of you, but against a student population of 120,000 students, that is, that goes fast, as we've seen. So how do you make sure that you're making a decision to make these dollars go the farthest? So one of the things I want to give a huge shout out to Tim's team around is you've seen in these slides what the outcomes are, right? And I think one of the missed opportunities that we've seen across the country is that many financial aid professionals like yourselves have been tremendously overburdened by these programs, right? There's not been a discrete administrative carve out for these dollars, as you know. There's either had to be determinations to use the institutional portion of HEERF to fund how we get emergency aid to students, or we've had to overburden already burdened financial aid staff to add this to the long list of things that practitioners have had to do amidst the Great Resignation when there may be even fewer staff members on campus. The full name of Sarah at the Hope Center is Sarah Goldrick-Rab. I will go. And her research center is called the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. We've seen that institutions across the country have done their best to try to get this money out. So sometimes the casualty of that has been not to focus on what the outcomes have been from these dollars. And I think Tim and his team have been doing innovative work, not only to think about the outcomes, but also in the collection of application data, we are getting a really good gauge on what food insecurity looks like across the campus, what housing insecurity looks like, what transportation insecurity looks like, what childcare issues are looking like. And that is really valuable data, not only to advocate from a policy and advancement standpoint, but also to think about the right commensurate supports that can be built around throughout the rest of the organization to meet students where they are. And Tim, I know that your team has been doing innovative data work to really think about identifying the types of issue areas that students are dealing with. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it might be an opportunity to talk about how you're thinking about data collection as a really important part of emergency aid practice.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that is the one area that what came out of our kind of pilot in this space was the need to make sure that we are working closely with all of those areas of the institution that are collecting data. One of the things that those of us in financial aid understand is that we need to make sure we walk very closely through the regulatory environment around targeting specific groups of populations for funds, and also the optics of doing that in the social media age as well. And so one of the areas that we have found as part of the future of this type of approach is to make sure that we have really robust data collection so that we can share externally with whoever wants to look at it, whether the outcomes that we were expecting were achieved. And if they weren't, that will allow us to start to be more targeted in our approaches in terms of the different types of students that we want to get at. It doesn't work for us in a one size fits all. We know that we need to be more targeted, and the ability to get underneath that data is really critical. And that's an area that we have an opportunity to try to focus in on. As an example, one of the areas that we struggle with when we ask students where what's their racial background. We don't really force an identity issue, answer, but what we found is that we have way too many that answer unknown. And again, in that environment, we then can't really start to get as targeted as we'd like. So there's a big push to try to make sure that we are intentional around why we're asking certain questions, and making sure that students understand that we're not just asking for asking sake. We're doing it so that we can make sure that we can put the right types of programs in front of them. And so we have a big push to try to make sure that we can get as clean data as possible, so that when we start to do some of these models, it really does bear the fruit that we want it to. Otherwise, we're back to kind of a one size fits all approach.
That's totally right on. And again, this has been a very innovative approach that we haven't seen a lot of, candidly, across the country. One of the other things that I think, Tim's team has really taken a national lead on is how we think about compliance within sort of the need to create a student-centered solution, right? So we had a lot of fun calls as friends about how do we ensure the unimpeachable compliance of this program, right? But there are some things here that Southern New Hampshire has done that have been really innovative to allow for us paying students in as little as 25 hours from the application, right? And that includes thinking about an innovative payments infrastructure for this program, right? So we've seen some other folks across the country, understandably so, right? Because the pain of doing this work in a way that's afoul of the federal compliance is unbelievably painful. But that said, we've seen partners that have created an application over here, and then the payment is over here, and then the right hand and the left hand do not talk to one another for perhaps a week or 2 weeks or a month, such that the national status quo for these programs is that students are getting paid about 14 days after application. Now, amidst an eviction moratorium environment, that may be acceptable, although now you're talking about still utility bills and other bills that can be shut off, right? You're talking about transportation emergencies where a student may have a car in the shop for 2 weeks and unable to travel to a physical campus, if that's a thing. But now we're talking about possible risk of eviction, right? We're talking about a lot about a child who may not be able to attend childcare or to receive childcare, right? Which means that the student who may be a parent may be missing work, right? And that lost income may translate into a need to drop out, right? So the cost of every day is really, really expensive to the institution from a retention standpoint, and of course to the student from the ability to achieve a multi-generational sort of health outcome. So, Tim, actually, I think there's really interesting data points about the type of student that's receiving this funding on average, right? Because Southern New Hampshire student population, there are many adult learners, many with dependents, right? And thinking about those considerations and the importance of speed, Tim, I wonder if you might be able to talk to that.
Yeah, just to give all of you kind of an idea as to who we, were able to help. That slide a couple back kind of showed you the demographic look at those. But on average, what we found is that the average age of the student that we assisted was 32. 81% of those that were approved by David's team, 81% of those folks had multiple problems that they listed in terms of the emergencies that needed to be helped, whether that was food insecurity, housing insecurity, healthcare, transportation. It was not just a one type of issue, it was multiple issues at any given time. The other interesting statistic for us that popped out was that 72% of those that applied also were had children. So they were navigating not only their own activities, but they were also trying to navigate the issues of family situations as well. And when we dug a little bit deeper, what we found is that 52% of all of our applicants had some type of food insecurity that they were dealing with. 64% had housing or housing insecurity, which is not too different from when we looked at the size of our population in terms of who we were representing. And then 36% of them had health challenges, which I think was to some extent either dealing with health insurance or lack thereof, or caring for others that had some medical related issues in there as well. And what was interesting in the data that David's team was able to provide us as well is that those issues persisted month over month over month, and that, you know, regardless of who was applying at any given time, those were the issues that students were dealing with in a consistent format, which was, I think, eye-opening to us in terms of, we knew that there was some problems out there, but not to the extent when we started to really dig in. And so for us, the issue is clearly, even though we have a lot of students that are on financial aid, the traditional approach to financing their education, there are a tremendous number of students that are also navigating some very difficult challenges that are not, or either aren't or are unable to be addressed simply by, you know, the traditional approach to financing their education. And what I mean by that is their disbursement of their loan is not going to come at the time in which they've identified that they have an emergency. And the ability for us to be nimble and to be able to be present at that moment, I think showed that we could be successful in terms of addressing the need, but also continuing the persistence of that student in the program that they were studying in. It doesn't do us any good if we can address the need, but then they drop out. And that was, I think, what we found with the Social Justice Fund and the work that we did with David's team, was that in a lot of cases, we were able to address the need, and it also allowed the student to persist into the next term and then the term after that.
Yeah, Tim, and to that point, I mean, again, getting back to the data collection piece, we've seen a lot of institutions, and again, understandably so, given resources, sort of just give money to Pell students. And that's not necessarily a reprehensible practice, but one of the things that I will call out is that, you know, about 40% of students who experience basic needs and security are not Pell students, right? And part of this is these students are in sort of the no man's land of financial aid, if you will, or no person's land of financial aid, if you will. And using heuristics like that may sometimes be challenging from an outcome standpoint. The other thing, though, is that in taking that approach, excuse me, you miss out on the ability to understand the sort of nuanced type of issue areas that students are struggling with. And some of the work that we've seen across the country, particularly in states like California and Oregon, is that this data is actually becoming really important for attempting to enroll students in programs like, you know, SNAP in California, it'd be CalFresh, and in WIC, in other programs that, particularly, you know, as Tim mentioned, 70% of students who are applying are parents, right? So are there child tax credits that may be able to be claimed, right? Because at the end of the day, these are actually student success line items if you're able to enroll students into these programs, right? And, you know, we've seen housing insecurity be by far and away the #1 issue that students continue to experience. And unfortunately, that's only going to continue given national trends around rent. But there's still $20 billion of emergency rental assistance that has been unspent, and that will vary from state to state. I do believe that Massachusetts is doing probably a better job relative to other states, but there may be still dollars available through reallocation that you can direct students to if you have this data, right? If you understand which students are dealing with this issues, there are opportunities to coordinate with student affairs, with enrollment, to make sure that students have access to other supplementary resources, which we've started to do in other areas across the country.
So David, I think the thing that I kind of landed on and wanted to share with this group is, so we started the Social Justice Fund right before the pandemic. It was a commitment on the part of our organization as a result of the murder of George Floyd. What we found was a we uncovered an incredible need within our population that I don't think we had anticipated. I was glad that we had the 5 million to give out. We definitely ran through that very quickly, and again, I think that reinforced the issue around we have some real unmet need in terms of our population. Then the pandemic hit, and we kind of pivoted to using the same approach with the HEERF dollars that we had. And now we're coming to the end of giving out that money. And for us, and I think the beauty of this approach is, and what you shared in terms of some of the legislation that's out there around creating more of a systemic approach to emergency financing, is that organizations can do this. And from my perspective, what was important for us, and you touched on it, was the need to be able to do this at scale. We are very good at dispersing funds, but it's not the day job of people to be able to identify in the moment that somebody needs $500 to fix their carburetor. We just can't do it in that kind of a context. So I think one of the things that we found and what we appreciate about the using your organization is that you allow us to be able to do that emergency funding. You take care of the funding side of it, and we can then continue to be the advocate on behalf of the student or the counselor for them. And what we need to do is to then start to be able to infuse this approach within the organization so that it is seen as not something that every year we have to budget for. It just becomes ubiquitous as far as the student experiences that you would have at Southern New Hampshire University. Can you talk a little bit about, because one of the other things that I think is important for this group to understand is that we also uncovered a large number of students that are unbanked. And what we mean by that is those students that don't have a bank account where we could just put money into their account to solve a problem. And I think you guys have a really creative approach to dealing with students that are unbanked. And for us, that really rounded out the program so that we knew that whoever was applying, there was going to be a way in which we could equitably and with some speed deliver the financial access that they needed.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tim. And again, this gets back to how Southern New Hampshire has really centered equity in this process, right? Thinking about access to these funds. The way that we've treated this is we know that the vast majority of students are going to prefer to receive funding through ACH, and actually Zelle is going to be an option soon. So, 25 hours may become 15 hours. But we also need to understand we need to meet students where they are, right? And for students who don't have access to the financial system today, we've made it so that students are able to claim a prepaid card so that there's access to an instrument for every student quickly. When we were doing the Social Justice Fund, we actually were even offering a digital card, right, which could be redeemed instantaneously. Now, of course, a digital card has some restrictions on vendor usage, and but the flip side is literally instantaneously that can be redeemed, right? So again, while focusing on the speed, there's optionality for ACH or for prepaid. I think at one point we were at sort of a 75-25 split. I think now we're closer to 90-10, may even be higher than that. But for those 10%, we are offering a prepaid option to make sure that students can receive funding, even if they don't have an account. And I think that data, again, Tim, is helpful because it provides a picture of which students are sort of embedded into the financial system and which aren't. So it is incremental data that's something that we can provide back to our partners to help create a richer picture about who the student is. And I mean, Tim, to your point, you're talking about making sure that year over year, you're not having to think about this. Again, the data collection to outcomes piece of this is so important, right? And I think a lot of folks, again, out of either necessity or scarcity, have sort of neglected to measure the impact of these dollars, but there is an ROI to this funding that can be, whether the case needs to be made to advancement and alumni and or state or federal policymakers. It needs to be the case that every time new funding streams come, and they will come, right? And so at some point they will be steady state, that the infrastructure does not have to be rebuilt year over year to do this work, particularly as you think about, I know Tim's team is unbelievable and loves Tim, but if for some reason someone were to ever leave, and I don't expect that to happen, but if that's the case, there is a cost when human capital leaves, and needing to rebuild that back without having a technological infrastructure can be difficult and problematic, right? Training, of course, is important. You need to train folks on systems, but if there are no systems and the systems are the people and the people leave, then that becomes a challenge. We've seen that, across the country, even some of the best programs where you have really wonderful one-stop models where you have social workers on campus who are helping centralize services. If the social worker leaves, unfortunately, a lot of the institutional knowledge, a lot of the programmatic design leaves with that person. So yeah, Tim, just to get back to your point, thinking about this year over year from an infrastructure standpoint is really important.
The other thing that I think is important for this group to know is another area that we uncovered, which was something that we hadn't thought about, was that there is a stigma attached to a student raising their hand saying they need emergency funding. And as much as we try to reduce that, I think there is something to be said about the way in which you stand up an emergency type of program, and how do you make sure that you are taking the stigma out of that, and that's something that we're very interested in terms of the future of our emergency types of programs. Can you speak a little bit about how, what you've seen in that space, David?
Yeah, I mean, Tim, to your point, and we've learned this, communications is almost as important as the program itself, right? And there is a natural hesitation, particularly from traditionally underinvested student populations, not to raise their hand. Advocacy, help-seeking behavior is very difficult, right? And what is actually unfortunately becoming, in many ways, a majority experience, right? Food insecurity, housing insecurity is an experience that's is one in silo and often felt to be unique to that student. So universality of these programs and messaging sometimes is really important. And Tim, we've done this a number of times, is we are making students aware of this program pretty broadly, right? So that, and in many channels that are common, so that it is, and I think we had Paul, our President LeBlanc at one point, email students, right, in a very public way, which takes the stigma out of it coming from someone of the president's pedigree or visibility, right? And historically, a lot of these programs were stuffed into a drawer in a corner office somewhere, and the only way that a student would know is through student referral, candidly. And the student would have to make themselves vulnerable to go sort of stigmatize themselves in front of either a financial aid or student affairs professional. So the Hope Center has actually done some really wonderful research on this topic recently with Dallas College to find the impact of nudging and doing that broad-based, and to see what the uptake of services are. And we've done this with Southern New Hampshire to continue to try to drive broader communication efforts. And this is a learning process, right? So Tim and I can tell you, we've been learning as we've been going on what the effective practices are. But we're finding that, again, the normative state is to make sure that you have the resources you need. And the only way you'll do that is to continue to collect data and advocate for the efficacy of these programs. But what that allows you to do is go broader on comms, right? And that creates certain challenges, but what it does do is it removes stigma in the application process.
I think the other thing, David, is what you've helped us understand is that it can be part of a holistic approach to emergency aid. If your organization has a food pantry, if your organization has access to a clothes pantry, or as well as financial access to financial emergency funding, it it helps to make sure that you are looking at this holistically and making sure that your approach to your resources is coordinated so that students who are in need can get to the need that they know is going to help them the most. I think when we first looked at all of the things that we were doing a lot, but it was very disjointed and again, not very well coordinated. And I think what we found is that, again, if you're looking for that ROI, and you're already investing in some of these, activities that are in order to support students, the more you can coordinate that with, all of the efforts, the better the outcome that you're going to get. I think we've got about 14 minutes. I just have one more question for you, David, and it's, kind of off of what we're thinking about the future of this. Our organization is definitely going to continue to invest in an emergency fund. We've proven the ROI. I think we've got opportunities to better coordinate and to collect data in order to support kind of the methodologies that we want. But one of the areas that we're looking at is, again, to try to destigmatize the need for emergency funding, is to look at more of a basic minimum type of income or thresholds that students need when they come to whatever school they want to get to. So for us, it's here's the minimum technology that you're going to need. And if you don't have that, we'll put emergency funding in place to get you to that. If you have a minimum basic amount of financing that you need on a monthly basis, we'll continue to help you do that. Can you speak to kind of what your organization is doing to kind of think farther down the road around this whole concept of emergency funding?
Absolutely. And Tim, you touched on a lot there, and certainly, unsurprisingly, you and I are very aligned. But one of the areas is we want to continue to owe more data to the institution, right? And to integrate this more into existing infrastructure and systems to try to make the decision-making frameworks and also wrap around support infrastructure more informed and more robust. Right. So there's a lot of collaborative work that can be done there to think about how this can feed into systems more holistically, how this can pull from systems more holistically, and how this can be integrated more broadly with existing student supports. The other is to facilitate the adoption of non-monetary resources, right? And as Tim mentioned, we do have an existing part of our technology that sort of orients students to existing geographically proximate resources mapped to food, housing, transportation, health, childcare, and other basic needs challenges so that students can see in their communities what may be available to them. But there is more that we think we can do there to try to be more sort of robust in either aggregating resources, right? Are there opportunities that we can provide for students that may bring down the proximate cost of living, if you will, and also support the amazing folks at institutions who are on the front lines? And can we help with developing more on the case management approach, right? Creating stories about students that are documented for folks that are interacting with students so that there's a case and a record of the types of issues that students are dealing with, but also thinking about, again, public benefits uptake. And what can we do there to make sure that the social safety net, which should be thought of as student success line items, how can that be better leveraged to stand in the place of the HEERF cliff, as we're seeing a lot of funds sort of leave the ecosystem in the short term? What are funds that are steady state that can step in and fill some of that gap? So those are some of the areas that we're going to be moving on immediately, but part of our roadmap has to be driven by dialogue with practitioners and innovators like Tim and his team and the rest of you on this call, as we can better understand what existing practices have been successful and how we can further amplify and connect and de-silo. To Tim's point, de-silo is a big word, those practices to make this more effective.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, this is not going away. I think we uncovered something that early on scared us in terms of the size of what we were looking at. But we now firmly believe that our future is linked to the future of all of these students, that we can help eliminate some of these financial barriers. And as we look at, kind of how we're going to succeed, it's absolutely imperative that we recognize the need to support students who find themselves in these situations so that they can persist. It doesn't do us any good if they drop out as a result of a $500 type of an emergency. And what we want to do is make sure that everybody knows where to go to get that, and that they can feel assisted when they do that. And if we can achieve that, I think we can achieve our ultimate goal, which is making sure that people get to discover their true potential as a result of their higher education goals and objectives. And for us, what you've done at Equity is allow us to be able to scale that type of an operation, and also eliminate any of the concerns that we have around, oh, there's an emergency, who wants to pull the team together to try to stand something up to do it. It just becomes part of the student experience. And we know that it's being handled with care and the attention that it needs. So I'm hoping that everybody on this call recognizes that there is going to be more financial need, and that once HEERF is gone. And from our perspective, what we found is that it's worth that investment, because we know that students will persist once you can remove that barrier from them. We have some time for questions if people want to ask. Jen, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Tim. Kathy Anderson from Berklee College of Music says that that's been their experience as well. If anyone has a question, they can either put it in the chat, or you can even take yourself off mute and just go ahead and ask it. We do have a couple minutes left. There was nothing left. Everything that was mentioned in the chat was already answered, actually.
In lieu of questions, also, if anyone wants to share their existing practices and sort of just share best practices or pain points that they've experienced, also would love to create this as a space for folks to just trade notes.
Well, if we don't have anyone that wants to share or has any questions, I want to thank the two of you. This was an excellent presentation. We learned quite a bit, and I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, and also a group of people that each of us can go to talk about what we're doing on campus, to learn more about what we can be doing. There was the link in the chat for the Hope Center. We will follow up this presentation with a recording as well as that link. David and Tim, would it be okay for people to reach out to either of you if they have questions afterwards?
You actually beat me to it. I was just sharing my email address to the chat. So would encourage anyone to reach out to me. And Tim is typically as generous as anyone I've ever met about his time. I want to volunteer his time, but I imagine that he would be more than comfortable if folks wanted to reach out.
That's great. We will follow up with that as well. Jessica from WPI, she also put in the chat, at the start of COVID, we also created an emergency assistance fund. She reviews the request along with the Dean of Students, and it's now been funded by a donor through advancement. So, she also wants to thank you very much. And she likes your points about collecting data. They do collect, but they don't mark the trends. So like I said, food for thought for quite a, for all of us on this call, and we really, really appreciate your time to join us today on behalf of the whole committee and on behalf of NASPA. So thank you very much for that. While I have everyone on the phone, I want to remind you, Dan did put the link to the financial wellness certificate in the chat, and we will follow up again. We've had a few sessions this year, more than usual. So hopefully by now you guys have collected enough to earn that certificate, and we'd love to see the requests coming in. I also want to remind everyone about the next session coming up on Tuesday, April 12th. That will be Dr. Zach Taylor, Assistant Director of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of Texas. The session is Begin with the End in Mind, Assessment and Evaluation for Financial Wellness Programs. So with that, and I will just jump on camera for 1 second just so I can see you all, but I wanted to just say thank you very much for joining us. Tim, David, thank you so much for your time, and hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, everyone.